little bit about your life, your early life in Jamaica, and the route to becoming a teacher?
Before I answer that question, can I just applaud the schools for this initiative? I think it's splendid, not because they've named it after me, but because they have thought this through. And, you know, I am sending all my good wishes to them.
Thank you.
Now, you wanted to find out from me about my life in Jamaica, my school. I was fortunate to have gone to an all-girls boarding school in Jamaica. And really, that was the making of me, because it was interesting. Most of my teachers, interestingly enough, were women. So my role models were women. And to have had a head teacher who in 1952 instilled in girls that you can be anything, you can do anything. One would have thought that in the old days that didn't happen. But Dorothy Parsons assured us, you can do anything you wish. I enjoyed my school days. It was a broad and balanced curriculum. I did sports. I was on the netball. I was a shooter in netball. I did geography, religious education, botany, interestingly enough, very weak on the sciences. Very poor at maths I was, just didn't cope with geometry at all. I was a prefect, and my father then ran out of money when I was after I had done the equivalent of GCSEs, got 12 subjects. I got some credit, didn't get any distinctions. And the head teacher suggested that because I was strong in English and interestingly enough, botany, why doesn't Yvonne come and teach English and botany to some of our first formers, which I did, which would be the equivalent of year 7. And that's what put me on the pathway to being a teacher. But I loved my schooling.
Okay, thank you. And when did you become a teacher?
I then became a teacher. In fact, I started teacher training at 17 and a half.
Okay.
Because in those days, you see, if you're a woman, there were a limited number of things you could do. You could either be a teacher, a nurse, a postmistress, a dressmaker. Very, very little choice. I wanted to be a probation officer. And the careers people told me I was too young. Go off and do something else and come back to us in 3 years' time. So that's when at 17 and a half, I applied to Shortwood Teacher Training College, again an all-women's teacher training college, which exists to this day. And I passed all the tests. And so I did teacher training for 3 years. So I was a trained teacher at 20 and a half when I started my first teaching job.
Fantastic. And then, am I right that you arrived into the UK in 1963?
Yes. So having taught for about 3.5 years in Jamaica, I decided to come to Britain for one reason only. That was to do a degree and to go back to Jamaica. And here I am 51 years later. Oh, no, more than 51 years later. Anyway, yes, 51 years later about. So I came in 1963, and I had been writing to what was called the LCC. You wouldn't know about that, the London County Council, it was called. That was before it became the Inner London Educational Authority, because I wanted to find out whether my qualifications would have been accepted here. And they assured me that they would, but I'm subject to interviewing. So I came in 1963, then had interview at County Hall, at London County Council on a Saturday, my goodness, and passed that interview. So I was put on a supply list. And I lived at the time in Camden and was put to do supply work in Battersea. That was horrific. I used to get up at 5:30 with an underground map and a bus map, shivering in the cold. I really have to say I found Britain sort of hostile. It was cold. I wasn't accustomed to red brick buildings. And then there was the dark in the early mornings. There was a lack of warmth among people, or rather, that's what I perceived. And I failed to get any supply work in Battersea. And by luck, my mentor with whom I lived in Camden was unwell. And so I managed to get into what was called Division 2, which was Camden and Westminster. And that was the beginning of, for me, a very good beginning. I became a supply teacher long term. I became temporary terminal. I went on to being permanent. I went to George Eliot School in Swiss Cottage and just absolutely had a whale of a time enjoying my teaching. And it was from George Eliot that I applied and became a head teacher.
Okay, so you became a head teacher at Ringcross Primary Infant School in Islington in 1969. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. So tell us a bit more about your pathway towards becoming a head teacher and your experiences and the reaction to becoming a head teacher.
In those days, you had to go through a really long process of promotion before getting to that point. And I must add that what I did was that on my own initiative, I've signed up to quite a number of courses at the Institute of Education in the evenings. So I did the academic diploma at the Institute because I wanted to improve myself as a teacher and to get more into the British education system. And then my head teacher said, Yvonne, why don't you seek promotion? Well, I couldn't become a deputy head of George Eliot. So the next thing was to go for this. And what happened was you had Her Majesty's, first of all, you had the inspector from the London County Council who came to observe you teaching. Then there was if you passed that, you went to stage 2, where you had an interview. You also observed teaching with Her Majesty's Inspector, HMI, and your local inspector. And if you passed that, you were then you had an interview, big interview. And if you passed that, you were then put on this this rather laudable list called Infant Mistresses Promotion List. Okay. And this was in fact in the education bulletin, which went around to all schools every month. It now meant that I could apply for headships. And there was a format for doing that. And I remember applying for the headship of a school in near Tufnell Park, and I didn't get longlisted. But then I applied for Ringcross because, of course, my strength happened to have been from the 3 to 7s, and I wanted an infant school, although I could have gone for primary. And I was, of course, longlisted. To my surprise, I was shortlisted. And when you are shortlisted, you then go to County Hall, these huge rooms, and you have your interview with members of what was called the GLC at the time, the Greater London Council, as well as inspectors. And I was surprised when they called my name. I couldn't believe it. I'd got the job. So to put it mildly, all hell let loose because of course, there wasn't the sort of social media we've got now these days, but the newspapers were on the trail. And so there were photographs taken of me, interviews. Somebody threatened to burn the school down. I had cuttings from newspaper with really rather racist things written across them. I've still got them. I was looking at them this week and discovered that they're all yellow and falling to bits. And I had to take my job up. This was in the December 1968. I had to take my job up in January 1969. And interestingly enough, I was escorted into the school by two of the senior admin staff from the London County Council, sort of escorting me into school rather safely. I had met the staff before anyway. Um, and it was just a matter of getting on with it.
Okay. And the reaction from the pupils and parents, was that welcoming?
It's interesting. I was thinking about the staff this week. My deputy head was New Zealander, excellent deputy head. And I had three teachers who were all, I had Mrs. Rekhi, who was Pakistani, Mrs. Das, who was from India, and another Indian teacher whose name eludes me. But we were very much as well a multicultural mixture, a very diverse group of teachers, including, of course, Mrs. Devereux from who was Irish and English. So it was a real mixture. The parents were curious, of course. Was I going to be as good a head teacher as a white head teacher? Well, the only way to actually prove that again was to get on with with the work. But what I created, which they liked, was a sort of parents group. I would meet with them, particularly. Things were so different in those days. I would meet with them. We would have parents' meetings as well to explain how we teach reading, how parents could help their children to read at home. There was really a great emphasis on learning to read. And in that way, the staff and myself became a team where we would share things. I brought some very different strategies to the school because in those days, I liked what was called an open classroom. Classroom doors were open. We had afternoon clubs where children could choose, although they were the younger ones, but they could choose what interests they were going to follow for about half an hour. And in that way, brought some imaginative practices to the school, which may not have happened otherwise. There's also another important thing. We created a closeness to our local community. So we know the Bobby, he used to come in for the odd cup of tea, the school doctor, the school nurse. In those days, of course, we didn't have the national curriculum, and we used to do something called topic work. I don't know if you remember topic work. You're probably not. Are you national curriculum?
No.
And so we would take up topic, like say, people who help us for some classes, and looking at doctors and nurses and other people. And I'd suddenly discovered that the children had no idea that you could have a dentist who was Black or a doctor who was Black in those days. Fortunately, my dentist was Black and I invited him up, and Victor came complete with his dentist coat and his bag. They used to have a bag in those days. Perhaps they don't now. And he gave out samples of toothpaste and toothbrushes, and the children sat open mouthed. They couldn't believe that you could have a dentist who was Black. So what I'm trying to say is that I brought introduced or encouraged in our curriculum to look at people across cultures and races, that our books, and there weren't many in those days, where we could find them were reflective of that. And I think that was important for the children and their parents, that the children were reflected in the curriculum. One other thing I have to say, I was very firm on, and I still am firm on it today, that the school is for the children. School is about the children. And I used to try and get this over to the staff. It's not you first, it's the kids. And they're learning, teaching and learning, emphasis on those.
Thank you. It's very interesting about the idea of the representation, the curriculum, because that's an area that our deputy heads and other groups are going to work on to try and ensure that it's reflective of all the pupils in the classroom. They can see themselves in the curriculum. So that's still ongoing today. You also worked with the Race Relation Board and the Caribbean Teachers Association. Can you tell us a little bit about your roles there?
Let me go to the Caribbean Teachers Association, because when I was appointed in 1969, as I went on, I realized I wasn't meeting any other Black teachers. And with a lovely man called Jeff Crawford and David Pitt, Lord Pitt of Hampstead, he was from Antigua, we sat down and talked about this. And I was very willing to lead a sort of group where Black teachers, Caribbean teachers could come together for us to look at how they can be promoted. My attitude was, if I can become a head, they can. So I created Caribbean Teachers Association. And it grew for years. And we used to meet once a month, and we looked at things like how you made an application for headship, how you interviewed. We had workshops, we had speakers, and we actually looked at teaching and learning, but it was all aimed at Caribbean teachers and in a sort of self-help approach. So that's that. I think I was recommended to the Home Office through Sir Peter Newsome, who was a director, to join the Race Relations Committee. And I was thinking last night that I think I went through 4 Home Secretaries, the last one being Willie Whitelaw. I used to meet, I think it was perhaps about once a month, to look at what was happening in the Black community. I felt very guilty about that, because I thought, should I really be here talking about the whole of the Black community, which is in the Black community is a diverse community. All our communities are diverse. So I actually also identified a group of people from the Black community to feed back to. So I was a sort of intermediate person between the Home Office and the Black community. And we would look at things. I mean, I remember the last one, we were literally in the middle of that when the riots blew up in Tottenham at that stage. And it was just a matter of communicating, trying to look at the needs within that community and the needs in that community interrelated to the wider community. I just want to add that in 1978, the Inner London Education Authority created the Multi-Ethnic Inspectorate. And I'm adding this, although you haven't asked me about it, because it's important. So having done 9 years of headship, I was encouraged to apply for this post. And my goodness, the Inner London Authority created this inspectorate of 5 people. Interestingly enough, the further education inspector was a Sikh. We were coordinated by Bev Woodruff, who was English, Mike Hussey, who was actually history teacher in Ackland Burley, was secondary. I was the primary person, and Jim White, who was an English teacher, was English. And so it is. We had this very, very big job of framing policies and guidelines for the whole of the Inner London Education Authority, because the attitude was, for the first time, they were saying, who are these children we've got in all our schools across every single borough? And we worked right across the whole of London, Inner London. And that was a real eye-opener, because we related to the community, but we also related to the bigger inspectorate in inner London. And by the way, there are something like 120 inspectors. So inspectors for further education, secondary education, special education, the whole lot had to be taking on the mantle in their job of knowing that the children who are our who we're responsible for come from across race and religion, different races, religion, and cultures. And how was that going to feed into all our work respectively? Very exciting. And I was in that inspectorate for 3.5 years, when I felt that the best place to do multi-ethnic in work was in mainstream. I began to feel, is this a tacked on, something tacked on? Okay, if you're going to do it, it needs to be in mainstream across the whole curriculum. So I then applied to become a primary inspector, because that's the place. And so I got that job in 1981, and 1981, and became a primary inspector, linked mostly to Camden and Westminster. Wonderful. I really enjoyed working with those head teachers. It was absolutely amazing that we actually tried things out. We looked at resources, we looked at the children, we looked at practice. And then I was moved, I was very sad about that, to Islington, which was Division 3, and had the reputation of being difficult. But I was moved to Islington as primary inspector. And then, of course, Mrs. Thatcher dismantled the Inner London Education Authority in 1989. And Islington then had to take on its own education. And I became senior inspector for primary, for primary education in 1990, when the whole thing, I think it was April 1990, when the changeover happened. And I enjoyed working with all the schools in Islington. I know all the schools, and it was a delight, yes, in doing in-service training, leadership courses, linking with the Institute, working with other colleagues in special needs, looking at special needs. Very exciting time, yes.
Thank you. Given your longevity and your experiences, I wonder if you would be willing to share your thoughts on racism in education historically, and where you think we are today, the challenges still that we need to face.
It's interesting, because when we say racism in education, I can't envisage, I don't know how to explain. One discovered that there were people who were resistant within the education service to any change. They probably felt that the bringing in things which suggested multicultural or multi-ethnic wasn't on. I mean, I remember, for instance, the one which stands out was the history advisory teacher, who was so protective of British European history. He couldn't understand why one would want to include in looking at history more broadly, a broader history which took in other countries, other cultures. So one got that sort of resistance in those days. But I think I think there were quite, what was good was head teachers. They used the actual evidence they had in front of them, that is their school population, as the evidence to say, yes, we need to be doing that. It wasn't a matter of throwing something out and putting something in new. It's a matter of merging, of including, and the whole business of inclusiveness. I think we've got better at it. I think it's moved on since 1981 in some ways. I'm just wondering whether the national curriculum, if the national curriculum hasn't pushed that out, because the nature of the curriculum perhaps does not explicitly state that what your approach should be one which is multicultural. And I would want to encourage head teachers on this this track, the head teachers who are doing this for the next 3 years. That's one of the things I would want to gently say. Look for opportunities where you can include examples from other cultures and races, because essentially we're all the same. We're different, but all the same. There is this whole business. We're very different, but we're all the same. And that, I think, should go across the curriculum. I think people are perhaps more open now, but I worry about whether there are policies in the school, whether the behavior policies in our schools include anti-racism and how to deal with that, in as much as bullying is not acceptable, racism is not acceptable, name calling isn't acceptable. But rather than having separate policies for these, should we have a broad policy which includes these, and that there are guidelines? And I hope schools are open to this in 2020.
Thank you. So you'll have to take my word on this part, Yvonne, but the schools that are in our group are really special. They're really fabulous head teachers, all the staff, all the pupils. They work together. They're very reflective and thoughtful. Do you have a final message to them? Something you'd like, based on your experience, or a hope that you'd like to share with them?
I really just want to applaud them. I think it's a fantastic idea. And just to go back, just two things. Create policies and guidelines within which all teachers, regardless of their senior levels, work. Because I think that the business of racism can also be very subtle, so that you can also have teachers from other cultures who will say that they experience racism in the staff room or in the life of the school. But if there are policies which embrace the whole of school life, because we're talking about the community of the school, then that will support your teachers as well as supporting the children. And just the second thing, look for opportunities within the curriculum, the broad and balanced curriculum, to include the experiences, stories, histories, where they're valid within the curriculum, to broaden it. Because, for example, Black history isn't a separate thing. I don't see it as separate. It's British history. So that I feel that bringing that together should be good for everyone, and will certainly broaden will broaden the experiences, the learning experiences of both staff and pupils. And so again, my very good wishes to these 22 schools. I'm so pleased that they're doing this. And just to say, I feel honored that they've named this after me. Very humbled and very honored, and thank you very much.
No problem. So just to end, thank you for sharing your experiences, thoughts and time with us. We really appreciate it, Yvonne. I personally found it fascinating and inspiring in equal measure. And I'm sure all the staff who are going to sit down and listen to the interview on the 2nd November will feel the same way. And we'll stay in touch. The other thing, we'd like to keep you updated on how we're doing, and maybe you could do another interview for us at some time as we go forward. But we'll definitely let you know how we're proceeding with the project. But just a massive thank you once again.
I'd like that very much. You're
Okay.
welcome.
Thank you.